Welcome to our recording of the Rise of Japan. We are still in chapter 23 and we are looking at how the Ottoman Empire, China, and Japan were essentially forced to modernize by the Europeans and the United States. We've looked at the Ottoman Empire and China, and we've seen how in both of those cases it didn't go so well, right? They were both forced to modernize. And even though they tried, sort of, but not really, they ended up getting massively dominated by the Europeans. The difference that we're going to see here is that that's not going to be the case with Japan. Japan is going to learn by watching what happened to the Ottoman Empire and especially China and realize that they're going to have to change, that things can't go as planned. I also want to make sure that you double check to see that you have the right PowerPoint for this presentation. So if you are watching this in 2020, you need to go to RenWeb and go to the resources and get the right PowerPoint. All right, so Japan's experience with Europe, as I mentioned, it's really different than China and the Ottoman Empire, that it doesn't fall to Western domination, that it's able to learn the lessons of China and the Ottoman Empire and turn itself into a powerful, modern, united nation, and that it will also take part in imperialism that the other European nations and the United States are taking in part, and that we will discuss more in depth in chapter 24. So in this political cartoon that you have here, you have the nation of Korea, and it shows Japan walking all over them, and that is something we'll talk about at the end of this slideshow. It's showing this a political cartoon is showing the imperialism or the dominance of Japan. So let's review a little bit. So the last thing that we talked about with Japan was dealing with the Tokugawa shogunate. And we had talked about something known as the Edo period. And we had said that what happened during the Tokugawa shogunate was the shogun or the general had gone in and slowly over a period of time that all of Japan had been united under the shogun, that the daimyos who were the nobles, that they were all being controlled by the shogun, that they still retained their individual lands, but that they had to follow the power of the shogun, that the emperor was there, but that he was just a figurehead. Japan is still under the feudal system, that there were samurai, but that their jobs had changed when you really had the uniting of Japan, that there still are samurai, but that some of them were no longer practicing. And then, of course, it's still all agricultural based with peasants there having to be the ones that were doing all the farming. So that's kind of where we left off. And we said that there had been in the beginning an acceptance of Christian missionaries and acceptance of foreigners, but then later on that Japan had said, no, we don't want any foreigners, we don't want any Christian missionaries, and they, like China, had isolated themselves and decided that they just didn't want any form of input whatsoever and were very adamant in not allowing any foreign influence. That they did allow this some influence from the Dutch were able to trade, and then they traded a little bit with China. So that's what these next following slides are talking about. They're just going over and reminding you about where we are in Japan since the last time that we. So again, we talked about daimyo that had to keep their house in Edo, which is Tokyo in the capital, but that they also had to have their houses out on their estates or their lands. And that if they went to their lands, they had that the emperor, I'm sorry, the shogun, kind of quote unquote took their families hostage while they were gone. But Japan was peaceful. It's not entirely unified, but it is peaceful during the Tokugawa period. There are some economic and some urban changes. They did have a long period of peace, and that allowed for economic growth, commercialization, and urban development. By 1750, most people in Japan lived in large towns or cities. You did have some emerging capitalism. That's where people were making goods and selling them and setting up private businesses, but these are still all things they're making in their house. Education was extremely encouraged. Merchants thrived in the economy. Remember, they had wealth but no status because Japan, like China, is still following the Confucian value of where you rank people in society. So your rank in society is based on the Confucian values, not your wealth. with the shogun being at the front. With the shogun being at the front, at the top, and then the daimyo, then the samurai, and then your people that grew things, and then you've got your merchants down at the bottom. Oftentimes, remember, the merchants had more money than any of the other classes above. Peasants were supposed to devote themselves to farming. They were supposed to live simply. They were supposed to avoid luxury. A lot of some peasants actually ignored the law and moved to the cities to become artisans or merchants. Some of them tried to look like their superiors, but the fact is that there's still a large amount of peasants. They're the ones paying the taxes, the same thing that we had seen in any other feudal system. So, in addition to all these changes, there begins to become changes within the control that the shogunate was able to have. There is corruption that happens over various years. There's a famine that occurs in the 1830s, and people are upset because they felt like the government didn't handle it adequately. And you begin to have a series of peasant uprisings and urban riots in response to what they feel like during the 1830s is the shogunate not really addressing the needs of the people. Remember, hungry people will do all sorts of crazy things. We already mentioned this, but there is some Japanese isolation that they issued the closed country edicts and said they didn't want any foreigners. They allowed, and this right here, if you don't know, stands for the Dutch East India Company. So they allowed the traders, but they were relegated to the island of Nagasaki, and it was super contained about who they were allowed to have access with. Again, we're just setting the stage so that when we're getting ready to talk about the period of Japan, from really 1750 to like 1905, that you understand where you're at. The slides that I have gone through is an example of context. So if I was writing a DBQ and my DBQ was about Japan from 1750 to 1900, everything that I'm telling you now would be an example of context. I'm setting the stage so that you understand where I'm beginning to pick up. So I hope this would illustrate. I try to continually illustrate to you what context is like. So then things begin to happen. Even though that Japan had worked really hard to keep Europe out, we know that Europe in the same period of 1750 to 1900, really looking at 1800 to 1900, that Europe was very interested in China. We've already talked about the Opium Wars. We've gone even further and talked about the Boxer Rebellion. We've talked about how the efforts to keep Europeans out didn't really work. Remember, we're in the unit where we're looking at the effects of industrialization. And the European countries really need these raw materials and access to raw materials to continue to fund their factories. And so they're going all over the world trying to get them. We've talked about that. The United States and Europe were very interested in Japan, and they wanted to persuade Japan to allow them to have interaction with them. But the problem was that Japan always responded kind of violently, and any time that they were asked, they turned people away. Japan was notorious for executing shipwrecked sailors that showed up on their shores. They were very adamant that they didn't want this type of interaction from foreigners. But almost as much as they were adamant that they didn't want it, the foreigners were like, yeah, no, it is going to happen. So in 1853, U.S. Commodore, that's his naval ranking, Matthew Perry, is credited with opening Japan to the world. He comes the first time and he's like, hey, I really like for us to meet. And Japan says no. And he's like, okay, I'll be back. So he comes back again with a large number of ships. And the shogun is kind of intimidated because here's this American man, this foreigner with a large number of ships. And he says, okay, we'll meet with you. So he agrees to meet with them. And they signed a treaty. And the treaty says that Japan will treat castaways humanely, so they won't automatically kill sailors that shipwreck up on there. But it says that American ships have the right to refuel and buy supplies in Japan. and that Japanese ports will be open for trade. And he said, listen, I can use force if I have to. I don't want to. And when he actually shows up there to meet with the emperor, he comes under a white flag, which makes the emperor feel more at ease. He gives them a gift of pistols and a weather vane. Um, and so it's really after this that it's seen as Japan opening itself up to the world. Um, Japan did agree to extraterritoriality laws, that this is where people, that foreigners in a country only have to follow the laws of the country that they're from. We saw this with the Ottoman Empire. Not all Japanese are actually okay with this, but Japan felt like if they didn't agree now, they would have problems later on, again, based off what they saw in the Ottoman Empire and China, and they didn't want to have to make all these concessions that were not in their best interest. So Japan ends up agreeing to a bunch of treaties. They're all pretty much not in the best interest of Japan. They highly benefit the United States, but Japan does it because they realize that they didn't, it would be war. And the United States kind of makes that clear. You either do what we say or we're going to force you to do it. And they didn't want that. So that's really what's allowing them to do that. So what does this result in? It results in something that's known as the Meiji Restoration. So there's going to be this change coming in Japan that's going to move them into a modern status. And these changes are what's going to set them apart from China and Japan, between China and the Ottoman Empire. Whereas you see this, the Ottoman Empire attempts, but they're just already too weak to begin with to modernize, and they easily get destroyed by the Europeans. China just resents, and then they just get dominated. In Japan, they do things differently. They learn from others' mistakes. So again, we already mentioned that they respond. They really fiercely did want to keep their culture there, and that's something that they will try to continue to do while mildly adopting some Western culture. So the collapse of the shogun. The emperor had, again, just been a figurehead. The shoguns had really ruled Japan since the 12th century. They still had a feudal society, right? You still had the daimyo, and they had their lands, and you have the peasants on the lands, and you've got the samurai and all that sort of stuff. The shoguns, though, so the generals that are in charge, a succession of them in the 1800s, we already mentioned about the famine in the 1830s, had showed that they really were having a hard time keeping control of things. And the daimyo really were unhappy about the decision to agree to treaties with the United States, and they really disliked foreigners. There's a couple of issues in both Satsuma and Choshu that show this. So I'm going to explain what happens in both of these. So in the region of Satsuma, which you had where these daimyo were fighting with foreigners, and two samurai actually killed an Englishman because they said that he had violated one of the laws of the daimyo. And the decision was that the noble had to pay a fee to England because Japan had been in the wrong. And the noble's like, I'm not paying that. And so the Japanese government ends up paying it because they don't want England to go to war with them. In Choshu, the issue that happens there is you have a lord was firing on foreign ships as they would pass by, and the European nations once again are like, you can't fire on our ships. So they find the lord, and the lord again says, I'm not paying it, and the Japanese government has to go in and pay it. Eventually, these areas are going to decide that they're going to band together. So not just Daimyo and Satsuma, but in Choshu, but different nobles from around Japan get together. They end up marching on where the shogun is and force him to abdicate. His name, the last shogun, was named Yoshinobu Tokugawa, and he's forced to abdicate or step down. And the emperor, who previously really hadn't done anything, he is restored to power. And that's what the Meiji Restoration is when the Japanese emperor comes back to power and Japan begins its modernization. So this is looking at the emperor. His real name is Mutsuhito. I do not speak Japanese, but he goes by Meiji, which I can pronounce. So He now becomes the emperor, but notice how he's dressed, right? He looks very Western, very modern. He's in power from 1867 to 1912. Here are his goals. He doesn't want Japan to get dominated by foreigners, so they're going to step up their game. And then he wants Japan to kind of draw on what they see the West doing, and he wants them to replicate it, but in their own Japanese way. They do it without violence. Looking at the Taiping Rebellion that we looked at in China, they don't want that to happen. And again, Japan, one thing, the European powers were sort of okay to let them play the game because they had less resources. There's a lot of resources in the Ottoman Empire and China that European nations and the United States want. Um, so they aren't getting the same kind of attention that those areas got. But again, we're looking at how Japan was more successful than the Ottoman Empire and China. So Emperor Meiji is what he's called. He's young, he's energetic, he's willing to be like the West to some degree. He wants to end feudalism, he wants to centralize the government. Interestingly enough, a lot of the daimyos supported him. They were like, okay. The few that didn't just ended up retiring and moving on with their lands and that sort of thing. He does a whole bunch of reforms. And again, we can't stress enough that this is what separates them from Japan, from China and the Ottoman Empire. So here's a summary of the reforms. In 1868, a charter oath ended feudalism and it led to the adoption of a Western style of government. So no more do you have the nobles that own the land that have the peasants and that sort of thing. They set up, that's what this was supposed to be. They set up a constitutional style monarchy, and this gave legal ownership of the land to peasants for the first time. The peasants had to pay an annual tax, which brought in a lot of money to the government. They are borrowing from the Prussian model, where the emperor oversees foreign policy, and then he has some political power, and then the parliament, the lawmaking body, makes the laws for the country. That's what domestic policy is. They modernized the military, again, following the Prussian model. They set up a navy. They set up conscription, which means they're requiring people to have military service. And then they abolished the samurai, and that you really want to know. They got rid of the samurai. We'll talk about that in a minute. They set up a post office. They reformed education. Literacy massively increases. And that is one thing that also sets Japan different from China and the Ottoman Empire is their focus on education and how much their literacy increases. The industrialization, so they're going to build factories, is funded by not only the Japanese government, but there is some foreign investment. For example, they bring in a lot of British engineers to help them build factories and modernize so that they are mass producing things, so that they are undergoing the Industrial Revolution like Europe and the United States. The reforms kind of have an uneven effect. The best effect was in schools and literacy rate increases. However, the political reforms are really limited. So they do set up the constitutional monarchy. So there's the emperor and then there's a parliament. They're kind of sharing power. But political parties, like you see in other places, don't really form. And so when people go to vote, it's really military leaders who are retaining control of and leadership positions in Japan. And that'll be important later on. So the samurai aren't really happy about what's happening because they have the most to lose, right? They're the ones whose things are getting changed the most. And I really want to go ahead and make this comparison. You can compare them to the reaction that the samurai have in Japan. You can compare their reaction to the reaction that the Janissaries had in the Ottoman Empire, right? So in both cases, you have these elite fighting forces who had high levels of society, high positions, lots of power. And then all of a sudden, as the government's attempting to modernize, they see their position wiped out. And anytime someone sees their position wiped out, they're not going to take it particularly well. And the samurai certainly don't. They are not happy about it. They see the fact that they're not allowed to carry their swords in public anymore because that's just something that's not allowed. The Bushido culture, that cultural chivalry, the thing that we compared between the European knights in the Middle Ages to the Japanese samurai, this code of conduct for how they lived, it's no longer supported by the government because the government says, look, you don't exist anymore. You can take a government job, you can do that. And so you see the samurai resist. Most interestingly, the place where you see the most resistance is in the provinces that had the most resistance with foreigners. That's both Satsuma and Choshu. But eventually, by the 1870s, the samurai not only are wiped out, so there are no more samurai, not that they don't exist, they just aren't practicing being a samurai anymore. And their resistance is met and dealt with by the new government. So the first task really was, again, we've already talked about this, you needed to get the Daimyo on board. And so by the Daimyo no longer continued to be in charge of their lands, they were replaced by governors who are appointed by and responsible to the national government. Again, the Daimyo kind of are okay with this. They have to develop a nationwide economy. They need to get rid of this old Confucian-based social order of system, and technically all Japanese become legal. Sorry, let's say that correctly. All Japanese become equal under the new government. And they send delegates to both Europe and the United States to kind of learn about how the West does things to see how they can replicate it. Now, remember, just because the law says that everyone's equal doesn't mean that people say, oh, we're no longer practicing our culture anymore. We're done with that. We're fine. Those things kind of still stay, right? A law is one thing, but asking people to change their views overnight is quite another, and it doesn't always happen. But the fact is that you're seeing Japan making an active effort to modernize and to change. So Japan borrowed a lot of ideas from the West. We've already said this. I already talked about the Constitution. I already talked about the idea that they set up the parliament. We're going to move on. So let's look at their industrialization. How are they going to have an industrial revolution in Japan, which is going to set them on the same level as the United States and Europe? So I said that a lot of industry was funded by the government, and it was. The government sets up a lot of businesses. Later on, they allow private investors to invest in the companies that the government had set up. They become a huge exporter of cloth, which is textiles. They're able to produce their own manufactured goods, again, something that makes them like the United States and Europe and less like the other places we talked about. There are some foreign investment. The emperor really wants people to be good workers and very, very loyal to the government. He gives massive subsidies, which is where the government will give money in order to back up a business to help them out. And so they invested in key industries: tea, silk, weaponry, shipbuilding, and sake, which is rice wine. They wanted those businesses to be able to train their workers and build the business up because this was going to increase the amount of exports that Japan had and allow them to make a lot of money. They built modern schools, lots of trade schools, again, focusing on skills. They had universal compulsory education, so you see the literacy rate again continue to go up. Japan is really doing everything right by modernization because they've watched other places do it and they're learning, well, we're not going to do this or we are going to do that. And so they don't necessarily fall into the same pitfalls that you see other countries have. Doesn't mean that they do it perfectly. They modernize transportation and communication. They set up roads. They set up railroads. Now, one of the things that we do want to say is that a lot of the industries end up being sold to individuals known as the zaibatsu. So they are individuals and they're known as zaibatsu. These are a person who ends up setting up what are known as vertical monopolies. So again, this is asking you to pull on your economics knowledge. A monopoly is when one business kind of controls everything. A vertical monopoly is when a person controls all the steps in the process to make a product. For example, you own all the farms, you own the cows, you own the railroad cars, you own the slaughterhouses, you own the meat processing houses, and you own the food restaurants. That's a vertical monopoly. Think of it like a ladder. It goes up and down, and you own all the steps. So what you had was these zaibatsu, or individual businessmen, would buy up all the different businesses in a chain to make a finished product, which allowed them to have a monopoly on a particular industry, which allowed them to make a ton of money. This stuff we already talked about. They had the railroads, the postal system, a national currency, and a national banking system. They are centralizing. They are unifying. They are making a country that is modern and not based on the feudal system. So here's the results. Not always positive. A lot of peasant families slide into poverty because they are taxed so highly by the government. Again, the government's got to find some way to pay for all the modernization. They do have protests. They do attack government offices and bankers' homes, but that doesn't necessarily change anything. You have people that leave the farms and they go to the factories working in low pay and terrible conditions, just like we saw in every other place. That trend's going to continue. And because of that trend, you do see anarchist and socialist ideas develop among intellectuals. You do see efforts to create unions and organize strikes, but the government's not having any of that, so that gets put down very quickly. You want to be able to note these trends that we've seen happen in every country. So with every industrialization, you have an increase of the poor. You have this idea of talking about changing how governments and economics work together. All of that happens in Europe, it happens in the United States, and it happens in Japan as well. Japan and the world. So Japan, through their modernization process, actually gets pretty strong. The military gets pretty strong. And so they want to compete with the US and Europe, and they see that US and Europe are practicing imperialism, which means they're going to other areas and taking them over, and a desire to get access to raw materials. And Japan does the same. They had workers that they would give let me say it right. Their workers began to move abroad, and it gave Japan knowledge about foreign places and vice versa. They encouraged their farm workers to take seasonal work in Hawaii and Guam and other locations so that they could spread Japanese-ness across the globe, and also so that they could learn about other places. They had a colonization society set up in 1893. They looked at setting up colonies both in Mexico and Latin America. The United States quickly told them that wasn't going to be a very good idea. They began looking at China, Korea, and Russia as places where they could gain territory to expand the nation of Japan. Remember, they're an island, so they're kind of limited, and they want to expand and get more territory. Why did they want to do this? They had high nationalism. There's that word we've talked so much about. They had a huge population growth, and they had economic needs. They want people to buy the stuff they're making, so they want access to more customers. And they also want raw materials, so that's why they wanted to expand. We'll talk about imperialism in general in the next chapter. Korea, which is near Japan, was having issues of its own in the 1800s, and they were having a rebellion, and they had asked China to help them, and then China mentioned this to Japan. And China and Japan both kind of fight with each other in the Sino-Japanese War, or the Chinese-Japanese War, over who gets to have the most influence in Korea. Japan wins. China has to give up the island Formosa to Japan, which is Taiwan, and then the Liaodong Peninsula, it goes back to China, but that is only because Russia, France, and Germany intervened and made sure that was the case because they wanted to control it. And that's everything that we're talking about right here. So you're seeing, here's Japan. Look at all the railroads that they have. You see here's Korea right here. They end up getting control over that. They create this sphere of influence in Manchuria, which is where they control what goes on there. Here's the Liaodong Peninsula. So Japan and Russia are also going to fight each other in what's known as the Russo-Japanese War, and Japan's going to win, and they become the first Asian state to be a European power, which is a huge embarrassment to Russia. So the Russo-Japanese War, what you have is Russia and Japan are fighting over who gets to control Manchuria. It's on the previous slide, that area in yellow. Both of them want to control that. They both want to put railroads in there, and that's what they're fighting about. Japan wins. The Treaty of Portsmouth gives that area and the Liaodong Peninsula back to Japan. The treaty is negotiated by Teddy Roosevelt. He was the U.S. president, and he also wins the Nobel Prize for that. Why is this? All right, so where does that leave us? That leaves us at the end where we're looking at the idea of what are we going to go from here? We're going to start talking about imperialism.